In the brittle records of the Colonial archives of 1716, hidden among trade ledgers and baptismal rolls, lies a name scratched in ink so faint it is nearly gone. Esperanza de Lima. To some she was a murderer, a heretic, a witch who dared defy the empire. To others she was a savior, a flame that burned on behalf of the voiceless. Her story begins not in fire, but in silence. Born on the outskirts of Lima, Esperanza was the daughter of a woman enslaved and a father whose name never entered the books. She grew up among cane fields and furnaces, where the air was thick with ash and the cries of the beaten. By the age of 12, she had seen her mother whipped for praying in her own tongue, and by 14 she was sold to the owner of a sugar plantation near the coast. The records call her domestic servant. The truth was far crueler. Plantation wives demanded her labor in the kitchens, while their husbands treated her body as their entitlement. To the overseers, she was nothing but another piece of property, unremarkable, replaceable, silent. But those who worked beside her whispered of something different, a gaze that did not bow, a quiet patience that seemed to hold back a storm. In the evenings, when the overseers retreated to drink and the fields lay in darkness, Esperanza was seen walking near the great coal furnaces. She would stare into the embers long after others had gone to sleep. Some swore she spoke to the fire, that the flames bent and shifted as if listening. Others said she wept, her tears hissing on the hot stones. Whatever truth lived in those nights, it was there, beside the fire, that Esperanza's rage began to take form. By 1716, the region was already tense. Plantations grew fat with wealth, while the enslaved and indentured lived in despair. Rebellion simmered in whispers, but few dared act. And then, without warning, plantation owners began to vanish. At first, it was dismissed as travel delays, accidents on the road, a sickness carried by the sea. But soon, rumors spread. Men lured away in the night, dragged into the furnaces, their screams rising with the sparks. At the center of every whispered tale was one name, Esperanza. It was the harvest season of 1716, when the sky itself seemed to hold its breath. The air over the coastal plantations was thick with smoke from the burning cane fields, and the owners, drunk with wealth and arrogance, gathered for what they believed to be a secret meeting. A summons had reached them, written in a hand they did not recognize, promising new profits, a hidden shipment of silver, and the blessing of a priest who would absolve their debts to the crown. 14 men answered. They came cloaked in satin and powdered wigs, rings flashing in the firelight as they stepped into the yard of the great furnace house. Some brought pistols, others carried ledgers of accounts. None carried suspicion. The guards had been dismissed. The workers had been ordered to stay in their quarters. Only Esperanza stood waiting, her face half lit by the glow of coal. The men jeered at her presence. A woman, a servant in a place reserved for masters. One asked where the priest was. Another demanded his promised silver. Esperanza said nothing. She simply lifted the heavy iron bar that sealed the furnace doors. The coals within roared, red as blood, hungry as the sea. At first, the men laughed. They thought it some strange joke, a spectacle to amuse them before negotiations. But their laughter died when the doors clanged shut behind them, bolted from the outside. The furnace chamber was vast enough to swallow them whole, a cavern lined with stone blackened from decades of burning. The owners shouted, cursed, pounded against the iron. Esperanza slid the bar in place. She did not tremble. She did not smile. She simply waited as their voices rose from anger to panic. The fire fed on their fear. Sparks leapt higher, coal cracked and spit, and soon the chamber echoed with screams that clawed at the night sky. Witnesses hiding in the cane fields later swore they saw the furnace glow brighter than ever before, as if the very stars had fallen inside. By dawn, the men were gone. Only ash and melted iron remained, fused into grotesque shapes. Esperanza stood alone among the embers, her clothes singed, her eyes fixed on the horizon. For the enslaved who crept out at sunrise, she was no longer a servant. She was fire itself, vengeance given flesh. And so began the legend of the woman of the furnace. On the night of July 17, 1716, the coal furnaces of San Miguel Plantation burned hotter than the forge of hell itself. 14 men, owners of land, masters of bodies, lords of cane and sugar, were drawn there by a message written in a steady hand. It promised wealth, absolution, and secrecy. Greed drove them forward. Pride blinded them. The furnace house was an ugly stone building, its roof blackened with soot, its iron doors groaning from years of use. The air smelled of ash and salt, carried inland from the sea. Torches lit the path, though no workers were in sight. The men muttered among themselves, questioning the summons, but none dared turn back. They had built empires on the pain of others. Fear was not in their nature. Esperanza stood by the furnace, her face carved in shadow. To them she was a servant, a disposable hand. They barked at her, "Where is the priest? Where is the treasure?" She did not answer. Instead, she pulled open the furnace door, and the heat poured out in a wave that made them shield their eyes. Inside, the coals glowed white at their core, alive with hunger. One of the planters laughed. "A spectacle for us, is it? The girl thinks herself clever." Another raised a cup of wine, mocking, careless. But the laughter ended when the door slammed shut behind them. Esperanza dropped the iron bar into place. The clang echoed like a church bell, final and absolute. At first came curses, fists pounding against metal, then cries of confusion, then screams. The fire licked greedily at their fine coats, their powdered wigs, their jeweled hands. They begged. They promised gold. They threatened vengeance. But the furnace devoured their voices until only the roar of flames remained. From the cane fields, enslaved workers watched the furnace glow red against the sky. Some crossed themselves, fearing the devil had come. Others whispered that justice at last had taken form. The screams reached them, carried on the night air, mingling with the crackle of burning coal. When the fire died, silence claimed the furnace house. At dawn, only twisted iron and ash remained. Esperanza stepped from the doorway, her hair singed, her eyes unblinking. She had not spoken a word all night. She did not need to. The world had heard. From that day forward, the plantations feared a name they could not erase: Esperanza de Lima. By dawn, the fields around San Miguel Plantation were veiled in a strange stillness. The cries that had torn through the night were gone. Only the scorched stench of burned flesh lingered in the air, clinging to the cane stalks, seeping into the soil. The workers, hesitant, crept toward the furnace house. What they found inside was not the wealth of their masters, but ruin, ash piled like dunes. Molten iron fused into grotesque shapes that seemed almost human, and on the blackened floor, the faint glimmer of gold rings half melted into bone. Esperanza stood at the threshold, her skin marked by smoke, her hair tangled with cinders. She did not flee, nor did she explain. Some said she whispered a prayer in her mother's tongue before walking into the forest. Others swore she vanished entirely, swallowed by the rising morning mist. By the time soldiers were summoned from the port city, Esperanza was gone. The authorities arrived with fury. 14 of the wealthiest planters, men tied by blood and coin to the colonial elite, were dead. Such a crime could not be allowed to breathe. The furnace house was sealed, the workers beaten into silence. A priest conducted rites over the ashes, muttering of heresy and witchcraft, while scribes carefully removed her name from ledgers. Yet erasure proved impossible. Too many had seen. Too many had heard. Whispers spread faster than fire itself. The woman who burned her masters alive. Among the enslaved, her name became a hymn of vengeance, carried in hushed tones across fields and rivers. Esperanza, they said, the flame that answers. The colonial court, desperate to maintain order, crafted its own story. They claimed the men had perished in an accident, a furnace explosion caused by negligence. Pamphlets distributed in Lima spoke of divine punishment for greed, but never mentioned her name. Esperanza de Lima was to be erased, a ghost removed from the official record. But legends thrive in silence. In taverns by the harbor, sailors swore that at night they saw a woman walking the shore, her hands glowing like embers. In the cane fields, Children claimed to hear the echo of screams when the wind rustled too harshly. And in the ruins of the furnace house, villagers told of doors rattling though no one touched them, of coals sparking to life though the fires had long since died. Some claimed Esperanza had been captured and burned alive by soldiers, her body thrown into the same furnace where she had condemned her masters. Others insisted she escaped into the mountains, joining maroon communities of escaped slaves where she was hailed as a queen of fire. A few even whispered that she never died at all, that the furnace had fused her spirit with flame, and that she walked still, an eternal avenger. For the empire, she was a problem unsolved. For the oppressed, she was hope given flesh. For the land itself, she was a scar that refused to fade. Centuries later, historians searching the colonial archives find only fragments, a missing page, a half-erased ledger, a name scribbled in margins. But the folklore survives intact. Esperanza de Lima, the woman of the furnace, cannot be erased. In the end, the cover-up achieved the opposite of its purpose. By silencing her in records, they allowed her to rise as legend. And legends, once ignited, do not die. Years passed, yet the story of that night refused to settle into ash. Though colonial officials sealed their reports and priests thundered against blasphemy, the people remembered. In whispers, in lullabies, in the hushed warnings of mothers to restless children, Esperanza de Lima lived on. The enslaved workers who survived San Miguel carried her name with them when they were sold to other plantations. Around hidden fires they retold the tale, how one woman had trapped her masters in the belly of the furnace, how their screams had risen like incense to the heavens, how justice, for once, had not come from the crown or the church, but from the hands of the oppressed. For those condemned to toil in the fields, Esperanza was no mere mortal. She was proof that vengeance could burn brighter than fear. But as her story spread, it changed. In some villages, she was remembered as a saint, Santa Esperanza del Fuego, the holy flame who punished cruelty. Women lit candles at crossroads and prayed to her for deliverance from violent husbands or merciless overseers. In other places, she was feared as a witch, a demon with burning eyes who lured men to their deaths. Fishermen along the coast swore that when storms gathered, they saw her walking the cliffs, her hair streaming like black smoke, her gaze fixed on the sea. Children told tales that the furnace at San Miguel still burned, though abandoned. They dared each other to creep close, claiming that if you pressed your ear to the stone, you could hear the faint screams of the 14 men, looping endlessly, never finding release. Some said the ground around the ruins was cursed, crops withered there, animals refused to graze, and even birds avoided its shadow. Travelers carried these tales farther. By the 1800s, sailors whispered of the Lady of Ashes, a spectral woman who boarded ships at night, her hands glowing like embers, her breath smelling of smoke. Entire crews abandoned voyages after claiming to see her walking the deck, her eyes two furnaces in the dark. Yet, in the cane fields, among those who suffered most, Esperanza's memory remained a beacon. Songs were sung in secret, their lyrics hidden as work chants. The fire waits. The fire answers. During uprisings across the colonies, rebels painted her name on walls, invoking her spirit as both warning and promise. Historians who stumble upon these stories centuries later face a puzzle. Official archives record only a furnace accident in 1716, no mention of Esperanza. Yet oral traditions across regions, separated by distance and time, speak her name with uncanny consistency. Coincidence? Or proof that her flame burned deeper than any empire could extinguish? Even today, locals near the ruins of San Miguel whisper that her presence lingers. Farmers avoid plowing too close. Tourists claim to see a woman at twilight, standing among the stones, her figure shimmering as if made of smoke. Some say she beckons silently, leading men toward the furnace door. Others insist she protects the poor, driving away those who would exploit them. Esperanza de Lima, erased from history, survives in memory. She is saint and sinner, witch and martyr, demon and deliverer. What she truly was may never be known, but perhaps that is the nature of fire. It consumes the shape of what it touches, leaving only heat, only light, only fear. And in the quiet of the night, when the wind carries the smell of ash, people still murmur her name, half in reverence, half in terror. Esperanza, the woman of fire. 3 centuries have passed since the night the furnace burned red over San Miguel. And still the truth of Esperanza de Lima lies buried somewhere between history and myth. What remains are fragments, a half-torn ledger, a missing baptism record, a priest's angry sermon preserved in a colonial archive. The official story speaks only of an accident, a furnace explosion that consumed 14 plantation owners in the summer of 1716. It names no culprit. It mentions no survivor. And yet, in every corner of the old colonies, Esperanza's name survives. Not in the libraries of empire, but in the mouths of the poor, the enslaved, the dispossessed. Her story has been carried across oceans and centuries, told in whispers, prayers, and songs. She exists not as a figure of certainty, but as a flame flickering in the dark, impossible to extinguish. Historians debate her reality. Some argue that Esperanza was invented by oppressed workers, a symbol of revenge against masters too powerful to oppose. Others insist she lived, pointing to scattered testimonies collected in secret. In one report, a witness claims to have seen her walking away from the furnace at dawn, her body cloaked in ash. Another account, written decades later, insists she was captured and executed by soldiers, her body thrown into the very furnace she once commanded. Between fact and folklore lies a chasm that no scholar has been able to cross. But perhaps the truth is not in the records. Perhaps it is in the silence of the land itself. Travelers who visit the ruins of San Miguel swear the earth there still breathes heat. On moonless nights, the stones of the furnace glow faintly, as though the coals within still hunger. Locals avoid the site after dusk, warning that those who linger too long hear voices, pleading, cursing, screaming, always screaming. And sometimes, they say, a woman's shadow moves among the ruins, her outline trembling like smoke, her eyes burning with quiet fire. For the empire, Esperanza was a crime to be erased. For the church, she was heresy to be condemned. For her people, she was something else entirely, a promise that cruelty has an end, that injustice can burn. Whether she was saint, witch, or avenger, she became a symbol stronger than flesh. Symbols cannot be executed. They cannot be buried. They do not age. Even now, Esperanza de Lima divides those who speak her name. Some call her monster. Others call her martyr. But all agree on one thing. She cannot be forgotten. At the edge of history, her story waits, half legend, half truth, entirely fire, and so the archives remain incomplete, the furnace cold but restless, the land uneasy. Time has reduced empires to dust, plantations to ruins, and masters to ash. Yet Esperanza survives not as a figure carved in marble or recorded in law, but as a voice carried by the wind, a flame that refuses to die. Her vengeance was terrible. Her silence was final. Her legacy is eternal. And somewhere, in the haunted night air of San Miguel, the wind still whispers her name, low, steady, unyielding Esperanza. Long after the furnace cooled, Esperanza de Lima's story refused to die. The empire may have silenced her name in courts and clerical records, but among the people she had freed, her memory took on a life of its own. She became a phantom stitched into lullabies, a warning whispered by plantation overseers, and a prayer murmured by slaves beneath their breath. In the sugar fields of Cuba, old women told children that if they cried at night, Esperanza would come, cloaked in soot, to hush them with a lullaby. In Brazil, rebels invoked her before lighting torches against colonial warehouses. And in Haiti, her name was spoken in the same breath as those who brought revolution, though no French archive ever acknowledged her. Esperanza was no longer just a woman. She had become an omen. By the late 18th century, priests traveling through the Caribbean complained of a devil-woman legend spreading among the poor. One wrote in his journal, "They call her Esperanza, the one who burned the masters. To them she is saint and savior. To us she is a contagion, for her memory breeds disobedience. But memory cannot be chained. Sailors carried her story from port to port. In the taverns of Havana, men swore the sea itself would not swallow ships carrying slaves, for Esperanza's ghost walked the waves, demanding the chains be broken first. In Veracruz, women told of seeing her at wells at midnight, her face veiled, her eyes glowing like embers. They left offerings, candles, bread, a lock of hair, asking her for justice. The empire tried to fight back with silence, but silence only fed her fire. In 1821, as independence swept across Latin America, Esperanza's name re-emerged in revolutionary pamphlets. A broadside printed in Mexico declared, "The Spaniards may erase her from their archives, but they cannot erase her from our blood. She is proof that fire is stronger than chains." Her presence shifted with every generation. To rebels, she was inspiration. To poets, she was tragedy. To plantation owners who remained, she was a nightmare, an invisible hand that could strike at any time. One diary from Louisiana in 1834 records a slaveholder's dream. He saw his sugar mill burning, and in the flames stood a woman with eyes like coals. He woke screaming a single word, Esperanza. Even into the 20th century, the haunting did not fade. Folklorists traveling through coastal villages in Peru collected stories of a smoke lady who visited fields at night, leaving behind the smell of charred wood. Migrant workers in Chicago whispered of a black-clad figure who walked factory floors, her presence a silent reminder of labor's cost. And during civil rights struggles of the 1960s, Esperanza's name was painted on protest banners alongside other martyrs. Though few could explain who she truly was, today, historians still argue whether Esperanza de Lima ever lived at all. Was she a real woman who burned her masters alive in 1716? Or a myth born from grief and rage, shaped over centuries into something larger than history? The archives remain inconclusive, the evidence scattered. But for those who believe, proof is unnecessary. They see her in the restless heat of abandoned mills, in the shadows of ruined haciendas, in the voices of women who refuse to be silenced. For them, Esperanza's truth is not in documents, but in endurance, because legends do not die when people do. Legends walk on, carrying the pain and fire of those who birthed them. Esperanza may have vanished into ash 3 centuries ago, but her presence lingers wherever injustice still smolders, and somewhere, beyond history's reach, her furnace is still burning, waiting, always waiting,